Okay. Okay, so hopefully you'll all be able to see that, but do let me know if not. So so today we're going to be talking about autism and mental health. Just a few, this is just generally what we're going to cover today. So we have about 2 hours, which is quite a long time. So we will take breaks, but obviously feel free to take a comfort break and get up and stretch as you like. So what we'll start with is sort of an introduction to mental health and the relationship with autism, and thinking about a framework for understanding how autism is linked with mental health, particularly looking at the different stressors that can accompany being autistic, and how that might impact on a young person's mental health. And then we'll take a break and we'll specifically look at anxiety and emotional regulation and some specific strategies for how to help your young person with that. Just a bit of housekeeping. Hopefully everyone's comfortable with Zoom 3 years down the line. I've mentioned about the timing, but please do. So it's a little bit hard for me to see the chat, and I will leave some time at the end for questions, but feel free to unmute yourselves or raise your hand and interrupt me if you have a question. It may just be difficult for me to keep an eye on the chat. So if I don't answer it straight away, please do feel free to unmute yourself. Like I said, this is being recorded, and I will be sending the handouts and any sort of information sheets and things that I mentioned, I'll be sending out as well to you as well. So don't worry about taking notes or anything like that. You'll have all this information. So just at the end, I know it's a really long 2 hours, but if you wouldn't mind staying around just to, I really appreciate some feedback. So I'll let you know how to do that later on. Okay. And then also just to think about the topics that, some of the things that we might be talking about might be quite emotionally charged, either if you're someone who's autistic yourself, if you're caring for someone who's autistic, you may also have your own lived experience of mental health difficulties. If anything is distressing, please feel free to do what you need. Keep your cameras off, keep them on, leave the meeting, come back, even leave the meeting running and take a break. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Just a quick note about the language that I'll be using throughout the presentation. So I'll be using identity first language when I'm talking about autism and an autistic person. But I will be using person first language when I'm talking about mental health difficulties. And the reason I'm just bringing this up is there is sort of a difference in the way that both of those communities the language that they like to use. So in general, obviously it varies on a case-by-case basis, but in general, the autistic community prefers to be known as using identity first language. So that means an autistic person rather than a person with autism. Whereas people with lived experience of mental health difficulties prefer person first language. So rather than saying a person is schizophrenic, we would say that they have schizophrenia, because it's not the whole of their identity. So when those two collide, we're thinking about an autistic person who may have schizophrenia or an autistic person who has low mood and social anxiety. So just first of all, a brief sort of overview of what is mental health. This is a definition that I quite like to use from the World Health Organization, because it's thinking about mental health as not just the absence of mental illness or the absence of mental health difficulties. So thinking about it being a holistic idea of well-being, and so actually feeling well rather than just not feeling unwell, and really looking at all the strengths that a young person might have, all the protective and the resilience factors that we need to consider as well. I think particularly when we're thinking about autism and autistic people who have lived experience of mental health difficulties, we need to think about all the different factors that might be contributing to those mental health difficulties. And that's things related to their autism, which is what we will primarily be focusing on today. But also it's really important to not just focus on sort of the most important or the most obvious, but thinking about all the different factors that might be in play and contributing to their mental health difficulties. So that's things like their physical health, genetics, whether they experience malnutrition, the social support, what are their particular religious or cultural beliefs, their own personal psychology, their coping strategies, their personality, and then also thinking about the wider environment. So it's really important to take a global view of all the potential things that can be affecting a child rather than just focusing in on a certain few that seem the most obvious. So when we're thinking about autism and how it relates to mental health, really what the most important thing that we want to do is not accept mental health difficulties as an inevitability of having autism. It's not every single autistic person will have mental health difficulties, and not sort of being accepting or resigned to that fact, but at the same time thinking about what are the components of autism that may have an impact on someone's mental health, and how can we support them in addressing those different components or those different factors. So it's really essential to have a good understanding of autism itself, both the more subtle presentations and the less subtle presentations. So for any of you that would like more of an understanding generally of autism, there's some resources at the end of the presentation as well. So these are the different components of autism that we think about when we're sort of considering someone's mental health and the different stressors that might be contributing to mental health difficulties. So it's things like social difficulties, communication difficulties, rigid thinking or lack of flexible thinking, sensory processing difficulties, other aspects of thinking. So that's things like theory of mind, executive functioning, which is sort of the ability to plan and organize oneself, any learning difficulties, and also any motor coordination difficulties. So all of these factors can all contribute to stress in autistic children, and it's the buildup of that stress that can then contribute to mental health difficulties. So it's really important for us to focus on these factors, but like I said before, it's not the only thing that we need to focus on. So when we're thinking about autism and mental health, there's particular issues that we really need to keep in mind. I'm sure these are not going to be any surprises to you, but in terms of the lack of access to specialist help, can be particularly hard for autistic people. And that's both, a lack of access to specialist services, but also then mainstream services, professionals feeling like they don't have the skill set in order to sort of adapt their interventions to suit an autistic person, and so therefore not really feeling comfortable in providing that service, which then leaves autistic people sort of left with nowhere to go. And then thinking about the lifelong nature of autism, presentations change, and particularly around sort of key life stages or transitions, difficulties can crop up again. And so, help might need to be accessed throughout the lifespan. I think another particular issue that is improving, but is still a relevant issue, is sort of the lack of understanding of mental health and autism and how they co-occur. In the past, it's been a lot of the time symptoms have been sort of attributed to being autistic. Whereas that was not the case, and again accepted as sort of an inevitability of being autistic, that you will experience mental health difficulties, which is definitely not the case. Autistic people do have a higher risk, are more vulnerable to developing mental health issues, but that is more to do with the fact that they are living in a world that is incredibly stressful for them and has a number of challenges, and they're having to cope with those challenges, which can take a toll on their mental health. So there's an added risk for it, but it's not an inevitability, and it doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do about it. So in terms of how we think about those stresses that an autistic person might face on a daily basis, a useful framework for thinking about this is sort of looking at each stress that they might experience as a cake. So each stress is a layer, and then up at the top is, you know, maybe that final meltdown or that final outburst is that flame being lit. Obviously, there are young people who don't have outbursts and who don't have meltdowns, but that can still be the experiences of those stresses can still have an impact on their mental health, and they may develop depression or anxiety difficulties. So the first, really what we want to do is help these young people to reduce or minimize the impact of those stressors. And the first step in that is sort of identifying the stressors and then dealing, you know, having strategies for dealing with them. So one way that we will identify those stressors is using this acronym, SCOPER. It's not the best acronym, but unfortunately that's all we've got to go with. So the first is structure. So I think naturally a lot of you will already have put in structures. These are all sort of the mechanisms and supports that you have in place to help your child. Things like schedules or routines and things like that. Anything that sort of provides a consistent framework and is predictable for a child. So if there are difficulties, or if you notice your child is presenting as slightly more anxious, then you can look at if the structures that are in place has any been changed. And when you're looking at that, it's really important to look at both the formal, so things like, you know, you have to get to school by 7:30, or you have to get to school by 8 a.m. and school starts at this time and lunch is at this time. Those are very formalized. But then also thinking about the more informal structures, so those that you've sort of naturally put in place without even realizing it. And if there's been any changes in those, you know, structures that have been removed, that are missing, or new ones that have been put in place. Does a child find unstructured times more difficult? So like looking at school, is that break times or creative writing times or drawing, or, you know, art-based activities, but also when they come home, when there's maybe times in the day when there's not as much structure, maybe on the weekends, or holiday times might be more difficult for them because that not having school then removes that element of structure. So thinking of, you know, really observing and monitoring what's going on relating to the structures that are in place, and trying to put in structures where possible, but maintaining a balance between, you know, enough structure but not too much, because it's a fine line between, you know, too many routines or routines that are too rigid can then increase anxiety if they're not strictly adhered to that. So that might be something like having a bedtime routine but not having timings associated with it or something like that, or introducing some level of flexibility. So, you know, we might walk home from school, but on the days that the weather's not good, we'll do this. So there's that flexibility inherently built into that routine. And then thinking about the communication style of your child. Communication is essential. It's an essential part of the human experience, particularly for, you know, getting our needs and our wants met, but also for sustaining social interactions, you know, conveying our emotions to other people, creating relationships, things like that. And it's this aspect of communication that can be very confusing and is often misunderstood by autistic people. They may struggle with verbal and nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communication includes body language, the inflections or the tones of voice that you use. It might be sort of the subtle nuances or things that have hidden meanings or multiple level of meanings, things like sarcasm or metaphors or idioms, things like that. Autistic people may be quite literal in their language use, so they mean what they say and they say what they mean, and it can be quite difficult for them if other people don't do that, and that can then lead to difficult interactions with peers or even with adults, and then they're left feeling bewildered, and that can be quite stressful for them. So really it's important for everyone to understand where the child's level of communication style is, their true level of communication. And it can be really like frustrating not being able to express yourselves, and that can often present as anxiety or aggression, but it's that not being able to say what you need or say what you want, or have a engage socially with your peers, but also not being able to express your emotions. And when we say being really aware of what their true level of communication style is and what their preferences are, that may change across different settings, across different times. Someone who's very verbal most of the time, if they're feeling highly distressed, they may shut down and be completely nonverbal, and so their level of communication will change according to their level of distress. But also not making assumptions about someone's ability to engage with others or their general level of intelligence that are based on their verbal fluency. Both ways, a lot of children who might appear like they be very verbal and have very good verbal abilities might still have difficulties understanding what's been said to them. And oftentimes, particularly at school, it might be easier to just acquiesce and sort of go along with the flow. And then they're left feeling quite confused and, not being able to engage with a learning task, or doing things slightly wrong, or simply not doing the work and then getting into trouble because of that. But also making assumptions the other way. So if someone who is not very verbal doesn't necessarily mean that they're not able to express themselves, so long as they have access to a communication, a type of communication that suits them, whether that's texting or emails or using pictures or drawing, things like that. It can be really helpful to sit down with your child and sort of talk this through and have a plan or a strategy in place for how they like to communicate, and what makes it easier for them to understand, both when they're calm and then when they're regulated, but then also in times of distress. So one strategy might be looking at making almost like a business card about about their communication style and their preferences and their needs in different interactions. And again, you can adapt this to your child's interest or your child's level of understanding. It doesn't need to use words. You can use pictures. You increase the level of detail, decrease it, so adapt it as to suit your child. So then we're thinking about the factors or the stresses that are related to others. So this is any outside influences and interactions with other people. So we're thinking about, particularly at school, their interactions with peers. Are they experiencing rejection or bullying? Are they feeling sort of coerced into uncomfortable interactions? They may be expectations on them, such as going to family friends, or going on outings with family friends, or going to grandparents' houses, and the expectation is to take part and you be polite and you ask how they're doing and things, but that might be really, really stressful for a child. And if they're not able to communicate that to you, then that can increase their their level of anxiety and then really impact their mental health. And also thinking about life events that are happening, and the relationships between the family, if there's, higher, if there's sibling conflict between sibling, conflict between spouses, what impact that might be having on your child. And again, they might express their stress or express their anxiety in an environment that's different to the actual stressor. So a lot of the time what we see is a child who's being bullied or, being rejected by peers at school is oftentimes presenting at home. So it's really important to sort of unpick what's going on there, that it's not necessarily where the behavior is presenting. And I suppose thinking about this as well, there was a talk yesterday about bullying and autism. So I don't want, if some of you have attended that, I don't want to reiterate some of the points that was made, but just thinking about the impact of stigma and discrimination. And I think really viewing bullying as a form of discrimination, I think this is more applicable to schools, but really taking bullying seriously, and you yourselves as parents knowing that it's okay for you to encourage the schools to take it more seriously if that's not the case, because it is a form of discrimination, and if you take that behavior out of context, it wouldn't be acceptable anywhere else. So it's not acceptable just because they're younger children and they're at school. It sort of starts from there. And unfortunately, as much as we like to, it is changing, and hopefully it continues to change and improve, but autism and mental illness is still stigmatized within our mainstream culture. So the likelihood is that your young person will experience some form of discrimination or stigma, and really being mindful of that, and taking steps wherever you can to think about how you can tackle it. Obviously, a lot of that is to do with the school environment, but I suppose where you can come in is reiterating to your child that, their experiences of discrimination or stigma or bigotry are a reflection on the other people and not a reflection on them, and really encouraging them to feel confident about who they are and their value to the world, reiterating that as often as you can. Sometimes it can be helpful for teenagers or for older autistic people to start participating in activism or self-advocacy groups. That can be quite a helpful way of counteracting the discrimination that they might be facing in school. And just being aware of the impact that this can have on their self-esteem. And it might lead to things such as, they might be trying to fit in with a peer group, so doing things that are not necessarily the most adaptive. So they might be mixing with a negative or a damaging peer group and engaging in risk behaviors, or things like alcohol and drug use, or sort of acting out of school, and really trying to unpick that situation and recognize it as potentially a coping strategy for low self-esteem, and sort of treating it as such rather than misbehavior or sort of the normal rebellion that comes along with adolescence. And obviously that, there may be times when it is simply youthful rebellion, but really just keeping in mind that it may be this as well. It may be a compensatory strategy. So related to this is the concept of masking and camouflaging. So that's where autistic people use strategies to either hide their autistic tendencies, or so that can be things like suppressing stimming, or employ strategies to sort of try and fit in. So, maybe learning to make eye contact every 10 seconds, or preparing scripts for what to say with their peers, things like that. So just to say that this this is a gray area. It's a very new area, so it's still being researched. One of the things that we do know is that it does have, it can have negative consequences in the long term. It requires a lot of effort and can be exhausting for people to have to do. So that's one side of it. And then the other side of it is the continuous experience of feeling like you have to hide your authentic self or your true self in order to fit in order to be valued, can then have an impact on your identity and your self-esteem, and itself can contribute to mental health difficulties. But that's not to say then that all masking is bad, because everyone masks to a certain extent. It's more developing an awareness of when you might mask, what you are doing to mask, and the situations where maybe masking is not as helpful, or it may not be sustainable. And then at the same time, sort of building up your self-esteem and understanding yourself more and developing your self-identity, including autism as part of that. And then, making a conscious choice is making the decision, is masking worth it? If you know that it might have these consequences, do you still want to mask? And it is the young person's choice. But so an example might be, it's all well and good you might be able to mask for a job interview. And if the fluorescent lights are really, really having an impact on you, and you might be able to cope for that job interview, but are you going to be able to work there 9 to 5? And what's the impact of having to cope with that going to be long term? And then making a decision about that. So in terms of counteracting masking, or how you address it with your child when they're younger, is thinking about helping them to understand themselves, their whole selves. So what do they like? What do they dislike? What are their strengths? What do they do well? Who's important to them? What's important to them? Really trying to help them to develop a self-identity that is their own, and that they may choose to hide at times, but then that they have that grounding, that they have that understanding of themselves, can counteract when they choose to hide it. And these are also other tips for developing self-esteem. So really trying to help your young person create a network for themselves of people who accept them for who they are, and love them for who they are, and allow them to be their true selves. That's really, really difficult when you're a young child, and particularly when you're a teenager. And oftentimes what we find is it's when young people leave school and either go to university or go out in the world and start to engage with different people, have choice about their environments, have choice about who they meet, and they find their people. So it's really about getting them through this awful period, and really making sure that they understand that it's not about them, it's more about other people, and trying to keep hold of the fact that they are worthy of love and deserving of respect and love. It can also be helpful, depending on their experience with autism. Some of them they might have come across that word used in a negative way, or they might have seen sort of negative portrayals of that in the media or in society, or had it used against them as a slur, or seen it used against other people as a slur. So it might be helpful to sort of read or expose them to more positive accounts of autistic people. People like Temple Grandin, Susan Boyle, Elon Musk. There's a whole Gary Newman, Chris Peckham. So there's a whole list of really well-known people in lots of different areas. So there's lots of resources out there for exposing them to different types of people. And really catching when they say negative things about themselves, and trying to focus on coming up with alternative things that they can say, focusing on what they do well, potentially helping them make a good things about me kit. So, photos of themselves with their friends or with people important to them, their pets, any awards or poems that they've had published or drawings that they're proud of, anything that they're proud of or that sort of bring out positive feelings about themselves. You know, good school reports or letters from family members. You know, it could be a joint activity where you encourage other family members to just write down what the things that they like about your child. And having that there for them if they can access when they might be feeling particularly low or need a boost in their self-esteem. And then also thinking about scheduling times to do things that they enjoy, so allowing them that space to be themselves and really truly do the things that they enjoy, without interruption or without having to worry about, you know, do I have to present a certain way. So this is often one that is quite easily missed, but can have a really big impact on a young person's mental health. So if we think about when they first come home from school, for various reasons, they may not have eaten. You know, the lunchroom might be a really tough place for them to be in, and so they might not have eaten. They may struggle to actually just recognize those signals in their body, which we'll come on to. So they might arrive home from school, you know, absolutely ravenous, not know that about themselves, or really, really dehydrated. They might have a headache. They might really just not be feeling great. And then you ask them to do their homework or, you know, make some demand on them, and that's sort of the last straw. So really in isolation, one or two of these things may not be as much of a problem, but when they're all piled on top of each other, and when a child's already been at school all day and had to manage all these stresses and challenges, it's just that last straw. And they can be really helpful to think about. So even just having, you know, giving them time and space on their own where there's no demands made of them when they first come home from school, and just having a snack or a drink there without them, you know, not saying that they have to have it, but just having it so they don't even have to use any energy to request that snack. Also thinking about pain, particularly girls and people who menstruate when they go, and actually also everyone when they go through puberty, all the physical changes that come alongside of that and how they might be impacting your young person. And it might be something that they, you know, it's really frightening because your body is changing and you may not know exactly what's going on. It might not feel like your body anymore. And then also just the physical nature of like growing pains and menstrual cramps and things like that. It can be really, really hard, and really take a toll on your mental health, trying to cope with all those things on top of everything else. And so then the second last thing is thinking about the environment. So there's lots of different levels. So as you can see from that picture, there's, you know, the immediate environment, which is what we're generally going to be focusing on, but also thinking about sort of wider environments. And that's things like that stigma and discrimination also come into that as well. So what's the broader societal environment and how that might be impacting on your young person. But focusing for now on the immediate environment. So their learning environment in school is particularly important, but then also their sensory environment. So I'm not an occupational therapist, and this is their area of expertise. And they're also an occupational therapist from Cognitive holding a talk for sensory processing. I think it was earlier today. So I'm going to be mentioning this a bit, but it's also worthwhile to access that talk if you can. But just to give an overview, so obviously we live in an environment when all these sensations are being bombarded at our brain, and our brain is having to, you know, sort through this massive amounts of information, process them, turn them into something coherent that we can understand, identify what's important from the unimportant. So that's, you know, things like sounds, things like visually what's important, important for us to be able to function in the world. Our brain tends to make make these decisions and interpret the information based on our previous experiences, so that we have almost a bank of previous experiences that we use as a point of reference. So one example of this is, in this photo, most people would sort of see faces. And really what our brain is doing is taking that sensory information and filling in the blanks, because based on our experiences, we know what if the details that are within a face, and our brain is sort of interpreting that as a face. So sensory processing develops throughout our life, but it's generally very accelerated during childhood, because the child is being exposed to all these new experiences and is developing that bank. So when we're thinking about senses, most of us know about the 5 senses, but there's 3 others that we need to consider. So that's where our body is in space. So that's proprioception. So things like me putting my hand there, me touching my face, requires me knowing where my hand is, where my face is, and coordinating that movement. That's what proprioception is. Your balance, so your vestibular system, and then your interoception. So that's the signals or the sensory information that your body sends to you. So that's things like feeling hungry or feeling thirsty, needing to go to the bathroom, feeling tired, but also then recognizing your emotions. So if you struggle to interpret or recognize the signals that your body sends you, it may be really difficult for you to identify when you're feeling anxious, because your body may not pick up on those signals, or your brain might not pick up on the signals that your body is sending you. So every child is different and will experience sensations or in a different way. And it can also change depending on the time of day, depending on their previous experiences, their mood, what they've eaten that day. It can change. So when thinking about the difficulties that autistic people can have, they can struggle to, first of all, interpret the sensations that they're receiving, and then also using those sensations to regulate how they are in the world. And also filtering out sort of the important from the unimportant. So we think of people being hyper or hyposensitive to different sensations. So you could be hypersensitive to taste, or hypersensitive to taste. But you can also be hypo or hypersensitive to different things within the same sensation. So it's not a blanket, you're hypersensitive to all tastes. It might just be certain ones. So these are examples of sensitivities. I'm not going to go through them, but they're there just for your own reading for later. So sensory processing is really important when we're thinking about mental health, because that stress of either having, being overwhelmed or overstimulated by your sensory environment, or equally needing to seek that information. So an example would be someone who is struggling with their balance system. They may spin, and that spinning is compensating for their difficulties with their vestibular system. Equally, someone who is struggling with their proprioception might be constantly moving, because they need that movement input in order to feel regulated in themselves. And obviously, those sort of behaviors may not be socially acceptable at times, and a child may be told, you can't move around, you can't spin, and they're using that to compensate for their system not being able to regulate themselves, and that makes it incredibly difficult for them to regulate themselves, and they can then feel very, very stressed, and that can impact their mental health. So we need to think about how can we either modify environments or provide strategies to help people upregulate or downregulate themselves, depending on what it is they're struggling with. School can be really difficult here as well. If you think back to your own school days, the sensation and the sensory input at school can be very, very strong in terms of noise, but also in terms of visually. We tend to like a lot of color and a lot of decorations, and there's a lot going on in school. So if someone is very sensitive to visual input, that can be really, really stressful. There's a lot of smells, like the lunchroom can be really difficult. So all of these things can be really difficult for a young person. So when we're thinking about supporting someone with sensory problems, the first step is identifying what it is that's underlying the issue, the difficulty that they're having. Ideally, that would be with an assessment with an occupational therapist, but obviously waiting lists are really long, and budgets are quite low for schools. And unfortunately, it just might not be a resource that's available to you, or it might be something that takes a long time. Your own observations and your child's teachers and the school staff observations are also equally valid. So when you're thinking about, I've included it at the end, but the Cognis occupational therapy website has a lot of resources up there to help you to try and figure out what's going on for your child, and maybe trial a few strategies or modifications that might be helpful. So it generally falls into whether or not you need to modify the environment, so either reduce the level of stimulation. That's not always possible. So if that's not possible and a child needs that input to be reduced, if they're hypersensitive to input, what strategies can be put in place to help them? So that's where the classic example of ear defenders is. But then you also need to be careful about those things, because so rather than ear defenders, some people use earplugs, and earplugs, that sensation of earplugs is actually really uncomfortable for some people. So you might be solving one difficulty and presenting yourself with another. Here, it's really important to involve your child as much as you can. They may have difficulty expressing themselves or verbalizing what it is that's hard for you, for them. But where you can, really involving them and helping them to come up with ideas can really be empowering for them as well. So these are some suggested modifications. Again, this depends on what's feasible within the school environment, what's feasible for you at home, according to your resources, whether there's other people in the house, things like that. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about is rigidity, and that really relates to ways of thinking. So when we're out in the world, we generally need some level of adaptability and some level of flexibility to be able to cope with every day, because generally, life happens, and small things might happen that don't go according to plan. And this can be really difficult for some autistic people. They can be quite rigid or inflexible in their thinking, which can cause them a lot of stress. When we're thinking about, adapting to changes, so that's changes within the routine, changing school years and having a new teacher, maybe changing classroom or having a new uniform, but also then thinking about how it affects their interactions with their peers. So some autistic people can struggle with their social imagination, and that doesn't mean to say that they're not creative or imaginative. When we're talking about social imagination, it's the skills that we use in order to be able to predict or hypothesize about what other people are going to do, what they're going to expect from us, and how we're going to interact with each other. And if you struggle with that, then every social interaction is confusing and unpredictable and can be really frightening. And so what some children do in order to manage or compensate for that stress is try and control those situations, make them predictable, which can then come across as, controlling or bossy. And sometimes that can lead to difficulties with their peers, and their peers might not, listen to what they're saying. They might not adhere to their rules. And then that can then increase their anxiety as well. a lot of the time, this is a really tricky thing to support a young person with. A lot of the time, it requires the adaptation of those around the child. So that's things like preparing them for change, trying to limit changes where possible, but also then giving them the tools, trying to introduce a little bit of flexibility. So that can be things like, again, like I was saying beforehand, when you introduce routines, already building in a little bit of change, a little bit of flexibility into that. So saying, we go this way to school, but sometimes we might have to go to this way. And there's no fixed date of when you might have to do that. So already your child is having to adapt to that. Difficulties with their peers is a lot more tricky to manage. And again, can be helpful to use things depending on your child's communication level, but use things like comic strip conversations, or social stories, or even social skills groups in schools, and really trying to unpick situations and walk them through it, and practice again and again, just to try and introduce that little bit of flexibility into their thinking. Okay. So we've sort of reached, been going for a little while. What I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. Okay. So when we're thinking about anxiety, again, the first thing, like I was saying before, it's very natural for us never to want to feel anxious and to get rid of all our anxiety. But anxiety is actually a very normal human feeling that we need to keep us alive. So the function of anxiety, let me just, sorry, double check the, okay. So the function of anxiety is to prepare us and help us to deal with a danger. That's essentially, it's the system that our body has in place. It's been evolved through years and years and years to protect us and keep us safe and keep us alive. So all the different parts of anxiety, the sort of physical, the emotional, the thinking, the behavioral, they all act to prepare our body to act and to keep us safe. So if we think back to when, we were cave people, the things that we were reacting to were things like saber-toothed tigers. And in that situation, we needed to react really quickly, and we either needed to run away or we needed to fight. And our body the anxiety response is our body preparing us to be able to do that. Unfortunately, our bodies and our brains haven't caught up. And so we're reacting to perceived threats now as if they were saber-toothed tigers. And if you are an autistic person living in a world where it's not built to accommodate your needs, and it can be a lot harder to understand, your threat level is going to be on high a lot of the time, because you're having these challenges and stresses which your body or your brain is interpreting as a threat, as a saber-toothed tiger. So this is where routines and predictability and sameness can sort of offer some sort of support and comfort with that, because they can decrease that level of threat. So these are all the different components of that anxiety response that I was saying. Again, everyone is different. Some people, won't have all of these together. Some people will have very, very physical anxiety responses. Some will have very few physical symptoms. So everyone's different. But each one of these makes sense if you put it in the context of imagining you were trying to fight off or run away from a saber-tooth tiger. So you need a lot of, your muscles need a lot of oxygen. They need a lot of fuel. So you need to breathe a lot. So your breathing is going to increase, your breathing rate is going to increase, your heart rate is going to increase because your heart has to pump all that blood to your muscles. Generally, people feel get stomach aches or nausea or like butterflies in their stomach, because what happens is your body essentially directs blood away from the non-important organs and areas of your body. So if you are about to fight something, you are not going to be eating. So your stomach is pretty useless. So your body's directing blood away and oxygen and fuel and all that away from your stomach into the more important muscles like your legs and your arms. And so that's what that feeling of butterflies in your stomach often is. So when we're looking at anxiety and autism specifically, autistic people can present with very similar symptoms to the one I was just talking about. They can also be different. Like we were just talking about, some people really struggle to express their emotions. Sometimes that's because they actually really struggle to even just recognize or identify what's going on in their body. And sometimes it's the expression of those emotions that they struggle with. So often anxiety can present as increased agitation or aggression, running away, which is that extreme sort of avoidance of that threat, or meltdowns. When we're looking at what causes anxiety in autism, it's multifactorial and it can be very, very complicated. Exactly like all those examples that we were talking about, we need to try and figure out what's going on, particularly for that person in front of us. Is it something to do with their sensory system? Is it, a fear of being judged? Is it a fear of rejection? What's driving their anxiety? And can we think of it as, is it a response to any of those stressors that we were talking about previously? So anxiety can be like instantaneous or acute, in response to maybe one stressor. It can be a response to a buildup of stressors, which makes then the triggers a lot harder to identify and pick out. So it might be that your child is going to school all day and is encountering all these different threats, all these different stressors, and then gets home and is just reached the level of their capacity to deal with these things. So again, everyone is different, and this may not be the experience for your young person, but sometimes it can be, and you obviously know your children best, but it can be good to sort of be on the lookout for things that might be an indicator that they're feeling anxious. And oftentimes people can use different words. So they might say that they feel bored. We hear that a lot, that they feel bored, or they feel tired, or they feel sick. A lot of the times we get sort of a physical presentation of anxiety, and so that can be headaches and stomach aches and really feeling very physically ill. They might become more talkative, they might become less talkative. Exactly like that example, they might be seeking a lot of reassurance about particular things. In terms of their behaviors, they might withdraw more. They might become more rigid. They might start refusing to do things that they were previously doing. Their sleep might be affected, their appetite. They might be you might notice more stimming, you might notice more fidgeting, they might start picking their skin, you might notice self-injurious behavior, so that can be skin picking or banging their heads against walls or hitting themselves. They might become more fixated than usual. So really it's any sort of change in their typical functioning and how they generally are is generally an indicator of something. And then it's about working out what's going on for them. So the first step for anxiety is recognizing and understanding what's going on. So that's, and helping your child to understand what anxiety is. A lot of times, anxiety will be talked about, or in schools, or things like zones of regulations will be talked about. So it might be that they have an understanding, but it might be useful to sort of go through what I had just said about the fight or flight response, and really explaining what anxiety actually is and why it's helpful, and what's going on in their body, because that can be, even that in itself can be really helpful to sort of understand it as their body is trying to fight off saber-toothed tigers. And actually it's doing its job really, really well. It's just doing its job too well. And thinking about, when we're trying to understand what's going on, trying to identify a pattern of what happens. And that can be really tricky if, first of all, if your child maybe doesn't express their emotions as much, or if they really struggle themselves to notice when they're feeling anxious. So one thing that's helpful here is to think about recording or doing a lot of observations and monitoring using what we would call an ABC chart. So that's thinking about what's going on. So the A's is what's going on before, which can be tricky if things are happening at school. But it might help you. This is where it can be really helpful to develop a close relationship with the Senko or your child's class teacher, to try and figure out if anything happened during that day, if they noticed anything, even subtle indications that they might have been struggling that day. And then when they came home, maybe you asked them to do something, or you told them to stop playing their game, and that was what resulted in a meltdown, or them presenting as very, very anxious. And then thinking about, what do they actually do? How, what's their behavior? So this is not just sort of anxiety, symptoms of anxiety, but actually what are they doing? So those things that I was talking about before, like, are they stimming more? Are they withdrawing? Are they, throwing things? Are they shouting? All of that is really important to know. And then the last thing is what happens afterwards? What do you do in response to this behavior? What do they do in response to this behavior? What does everyone do in response to this behavior? And that can be really useful to know, and potentially highlight what might be keeping that behavior going. So in that example that we were talking about, it's obviously really, really natural to want to reassure, but what's that doing? Or another classic example is thinking about if a child is doing homework and they are really struggling with their homework, and that's starting to affect their perception of themselves, and it's really difficult for them to be in their homework. If they then start shouting or kicking or throwing things, do they no longer have to do their homework? And is that then the reason that they're displaying those behaviors? So that can be really helpful to do. So something like this, thinking about what was going on right beforehand, what potentially do you think was going on in school, what actually happened, what happened afterwards? Do you have any ideas about what the potential trigger might be? And really, that's a lot of what we would do as well. Is it's trying to capture a lot of information, because that's when patterns tend to emerge. And it might seem like I really just don't know what triggered this behavior, but over time you see that maybe it's really after school, and it's just that they need time to decompress, or it might be the trigger then might jump out to you the more times it happens. And it's really hard to, even though I'm sure it's happened to you multiple times already, it's when it's there in front of you and you see, oh, okay, it's normally when this happens, which is really hard information to keep in your mind if it's happening frequently, especially. So just to go back to this slide then as well. Okay, so thinking about the stressors that we were talking about, so the SCOPER acronym, and are there different aspects of their autism that might be contributing to their anxiety, what those might be. And then again, sort of prioritizing, not working on more than one situation or more than one behavior at a time, because this is really tough work and requires a lot of effort on your part and on your child's part. So not trying to tackle everything at once, really prioritizing. Working together to develop a plan. So like I said, when it's sort of a step-by-step ladder of different situations, and being, you can call it being brave, and facing their anxiety. And that's not to say that they're facing it alone. You're there to support them in using strategies and things like that. But not trying to, it's them trying to reduce their own anxiety. And using rewards, really praising and encouraging them, and whenever you notice it, praising it when they're being brave, praising when they're using the strategies, just continuously reinforcing that. Practicing relaxation strategies. And the thing with these relaxation strategies is they need to be practiced and learned when a child is feeling calm, because it's really, really hard. The example I always use with my clients is, if it's easier, if you were learning to ride a bike for the first time, is it easier to ride a bike if a bear is chasing you? To learn how to ride a bike if a bear is chasing you? Or is it better to learn when you can take your own time with it and you're not feeling stressed? And that's essentially, a lot of the time what will happen is we'll try and use these relaxation strategies for the first time when we're at the height of our anxiety, when we're feeling really anxious. And that's really hard to do. So it's the practice when they're feeling calm and when they're regulated, so that they can then apply that when they're feeling anxious. But it can be really tough to do that if they haven't practiced it a lot beforehand. And working together, involving your child, saying, like, I've noticed this is something that's really hard for you, and it's causing you a lot of stress, and I really want to help you feel better. Can we work together to figure out what's going on and what sort of things we can try? And then also, so it's sort of a balance between, again, prioritizing and doing analysis about, what is a situation worth the anxiety? And that's relating to things like, if your child really hates shopping, grocery food shopping, and finds it a really overwhelming experience, and generally will, have outbursts, is it feasible for you to not do that shopping or not have them come along with you? Is it feasible to do online shopping? Is it? And then, so again, and that's a completely personal decision as to what is feasible for you, what other avenues of support do you have, and what is worth it for you in terms of having that anxiety, because it will be, none of these strategies are going to be sort of a quick fix. They require a lot of practice, a lot of effort, and pain and tears on your part and on your child's part. So really trying to figure out what to you is worth it. And then in those instances where it's unavoidable, thinking about having survival kits. So that's bringing the sensory sort of thing into play, but also bringing, if your child has any preoccupations or their interests, having this kit around, where it might be, having chewing gum, having something to smell that they really like, coloring books, iPad time, if that's something that's okay with you, listening to music, really anything, playing cards, Uno, any and all things, to have that, to then make unavoidable situations easier. Just check that. So that's often what we find is, and again, those strategies are a lot easier to put in place when you're just at the sort of on the rise, but not when you're at the peak. And then it's really trying to help people learn to recognize when those early signs, when they are at the point when those strategies will be useful, and practice that, and really trying to help them to become more independent in their use of recognizing the earlier stages that they can use them. And there's lots of difficulties associated with that, which we will come on to in just one slide. This is just, so a lot of times it's our first instinct, like I was saying before, you want to take away the worry, you want to take away the pain and the distress that your child is feeling. And sometimes it's hard to know what the right thing to say is. Sometimes a lot of parents can feel afraid that maybe connecting with the worry or validating the worry might make it feel really scary, might make it feel really real. And sometimes with the best will in the world, we might say, you know, you'll be fine, you'll be okay, it's not a big deal, you'll be fine. And they seem really supportive, and obviously they have the best intention, but sometimes they can be viewed by others as dismissive of their feelings. Because in that moment, it doesn't feel like it's going to be fine. It doesn't feel, you know, their feelings feel enormous. So then focusing more on connecting with and validating their worry, and offering your support and your encouragement without trying to dismiss or minimize what they're going through. So these are just some helpful phrases. Obviously, you know, some of them might not work. None of them might not work. You might have your own phrases that work particularly well for your own children. Okay, so in terms of relating to anxiety, so emotion regulation is something that is developmental. There is a natural learning curve. If you think about sort of toddlers and the terrible twos, it is something that's really, really hard to do. There are lots of adults that struggle with it as well, but it's the ability to manage your emotions and also your behavior according to different situations. So being able to know, you know, sometimes it is okay to shout and scream, but being able to differentiate when it's okay, and that it's not okay to do that to other people or things like that. So really what we're thinking about with emotion regulation is, can someone handle strong emotions? Can they find ways to express those emotions more adaptively? Because the thing that we need to be continuously reiterating is that the feelings themselves are okay. All these feelings are valid, but it's the expression of those feelings, or what we do with those feelings, that we need to think about, that need to be expressed in a more adaptive way. And it can be helpful to sort of reframe this in your mind, as rather than sort of bad behavior or misbehavior, but a skill that needs to be taught. So your child needs to learn how to do this, and that you as the parent are their coach, and you're there to help them. So rather than, and again, a very natural response is to avoid situations or take on that role yourself, but that then limits their ability to develop their own skill. So then it's about that in between, that scaffolding. So being there, but also allowing them opportunities to do things a bit themselves. So an example of that would be if homework is something that's really, really difficult, and at a time where your child might get really frustrated and have outbursts, rather than not doing the homework altogether, or helping your child with every single question, maybe helping them with a few, and then letting them try a few by themselves. And also, you know, acknowledging and identifying and validating that it's frustrating when you're not able to do questions, validating the fact that they're working really hard and you can see how hard they're working, and continuously validating their feelings of frustration. One really important thing, like I was saying before, is learning to identify your emotions. So we would call this affective education. So identifying and recognizing what you're feeling in the moment. So it can be helpful to understand what's being taught in your child's school. Most schools use zones of regulation, but your child's classroom may use something different. they might not use anything at all, but just in case they are, what's really, really important here is to have consistency across all environments, because that can help children learn to generalize skills. And just that repetition and that constant, it just gives them more opportunities to practice. And for your own, your own learning, you can, if you want to model to them, if they have used zones of regulation in school, you can sort of start introducing that language, and using that language yourself, and that can help them also learn and develop their own skills. Part of that is monitoring, so sort of similar to the anxiety journal, but just, it doesn't have to be as formal as that, but continuously sort of checking in with your child, and maybe not asking them specifically how they're feeling, because that might be a really tricky thing initially, but what do you feel in your body right now? And they just have to label the sensations that they have in their body, rather than having to describe it, which can be quite tricky. To label it, to know that something is, my stomach is feeling all fizzy, and that means I'm feeling anxious. But to start that step of, what does your stomach feel like? And then the next step is, okay, that might be anxiety. And then from then on, learning to recognize, okay, when I feel that, I feel anxious. So it's really sort of building a foundation first of all, knowing what emotions are. So you can play sort of games where you have different facial expressions, or, TV shows or films, trying to guess, oh, what do you think that person's feeling? And why do you think they're feeling that? Because okay, they're crying. Maybe they feel sad, or, really picking out the details of how other emotions can be shown on other people, and just sort of that continuous education. Just let me check the chat. Yeah, so Inside Out is great, and the monster, the red beast, is also really good as well for anger. But Inside Out is great as well because it's presented in such a discreet way, an indirect way, and it's a really nice way of watching that with your child and maybe saying, oh, well, do you feel like fear now, or do you feel like disgust now? Because it's quite a clear visually, it's quite clear as to the distinctions between those 5 emotions, and then gives them sort of an anchor that they can think in their mind, oh, okay, do I feel like that? Does my experience fit like that? So yeah, Inside Out is a great one. So the sort of steps when we're thinking about emotional regulation is, let me just go back. Identifying emotions, so knowing the words for emotions, identifying emotions in others, identifying emotions in yourself, recognizing when you feel those emotions, and then recognizing how you express those emotions, triggers for strong emotions, and strategies that you can use to help with strong emotions. And then the sort of final part is being able to evaluate like the success of a strategy. And if it hasn't been helpful, having another one that you can turn to as well. So one thing that I found particularly helpful is thinking about this as a toolbox. And if your child is very visual, this can be a really nice way of highlighting these things or explaining these things. Your child can also make their own like physical toolbox if that's helpful as well. So it's thinking about the different tools that you might need. And I'm going to send a handout on the emotional toolbox as well. It's like a worksheet that you can go through with your child. So thinking about all the different strategies within these different domains, and every child is different, and you can be as creative as you like, and use your imagination here. But so you can say the hammer represents physical strategies. What can you do with that? Maybe your child really likes boxing or martial arts. So it might be handy to have a really old pillow that they can punch when they go home if they're feeling angry. Or again, it's tailor it to your child's presentation and their own interests and what they're most likely to do as well, and then also what's acceptable to you. But so yeah, relaxation could be things like drawing, painting, playing a game if it's relaxing for them. But obviously just be aware that some of those games are incredibly stimulating, so it may not be, it might be a good one to include in the toolbox that might not be relaxing, but some of them are really relaxing for your children. So again, it's depending on how they are. Social things, and again, it's being social could be interacting with their pet. So it's what's social for them, what is a good tool for them, rather than making any assumptions or putting our own expectations about, oh, well, talking to a friend will really helps me, maybe that will help. It might not help them. Special interest can be really helpful here. So thinking about, and again, it's depending on your own resources and what is feasible for you, but allowing them to tell you all about their Minecraft thing with no interruptions for 15-20 minutes. And is that something that is feasible for people to do in the family? And would that be rewarding, or would that be helpful for them as well? So in terms of your own actions, I'm sure a lot of you are doing most of this anyways, just as a helpful reminder. But like I said, accepting and validating their emotions is really important, and something that is actually quite difficult to do in the moment, because it's really hard to separate the two, the emotions and the expression of the emotions. And really, anger, frustration, anxiety, they're all part of the human experience. They're all okay. But aggression and destruction of property and things like that are not okay. And it's separating those two. Talking, again, like I was saying, talking about your own feelings, model emotional regulation yourself. So narrate what you're doing if you've had a bad day at work. And it might not be, some children don't really like to be lectured by their parents or taught by their parents, so they may not appreciate being sat down and sort of talk through all the steps. But even if they're in earshot and you're having a conversation with someone else and you just talk about the tough day at work, and someone said something mean to you and you felt really frustrated and this happened, and I wanted to hit them, but then I took a deep breath and I thought, no, I can't do that because this and this. And so instead I took myself to the bathroom and I took 2-3 deep breaths. And rather than sort of using that as a teaching, but you're just sort of modeling it, it becomes part of your everyday language. Also helping your child think about positive self-talk. So I can manage this. I'll get through this. I can do this. And sort of reminding them, and this is where you're sort of their coach. They're not doing it for them, but just reminding them of the things that they can use. And again, once you've sort of collected enough data and you probably already know which ones tend to result in outbursts and which ones might be particularly tricky, using that as an opportunity to discuss with your child. I've noticed this is something that's really hard. I don't like you feeling upset. What can we do about this? And use this as sort of an opportunity to teach them problem solving. And then again, helping them to become more aware of when those emotions are building, and when they can step in and use these strategies. And praising and reinforcing anything that the things that you praise and the things that you reinforce, you're more likely to see. And often what we do is, if someone is doing really well and playing by themselves or being quiet, that's when we decide, oh, now I've got all this time, I can do the housework, I can do all the things that I haven't been able to do before. But actually, and then all of our we give all of our attention when they are shouting or they are acting out, and that's almost the opposite of what we want, what we should be doing. We should be giving our attention when they are really doing the things, the behaviors that we want to see more of. Okay, so just as the final, just aware of the time. So just quickly going to go through, so mindfulness can be a really, really helpful tool to be using, again, practicing as often as possible. And mindfulness is different for everybody. It's not meditation. It's not necessarily meditation. Meditation is part of mindfulness, but a lot of people don't like meditation, and it doesn't work for them. And that doesn't mean that mindfulness won't work for them. Really, mindfulness is about being aware of and paying attention to the here and now. And that's why it's such a useful thing, because really that's what we're trying to help children learn in terms of emotional regulation and anxiety regulation, connecting with the here and now and what's going on for them in their body and their mind is a really important skill. And then the other, so it's that being aware and connecting, being in the present, but then also accepting things without judgment. And that's the bit that's very, very tricky. But if you have that as a skill, it's really, really helpful for anxiety and for emotional regulation. So you're accepting everything, your thoughts, your feelings, all of these are just temporary things that are happening, that they don't need to be analyzed. And when we say acceptance, we don't mean, accepting if something bad has been done to you, or accepting that something bad has happened, or being resigned to it. It's more about, okay, this is what's happening to me now, and not trying to push it away, not trying to resist it, not trying to deny it. This is what I'm feeling right now, and not trying to analyze it or critique it or judge yourself. That's the most important. So we're not trying to change thoughts and feelings. We're not trying to prevent or get rid of these thoughts. We're simply being aware of them and letting them go. And it's this sort of observing without judgment, observing and accepting, that paradoxically creates that time and that space in order to process and allow those emotions and those thoughts to change themselves. Because generally what we resist persists. And it's that just observing them, noticing them, accepting them is actually gives us the time and the space to take a step back, process what's happened to us, and maybe not react in an automatic or habitual way, because that's generally what we're doing. It's what everybody is doing. But mindfulness gives us that space to then take a step back from how we would normally react automatically without thinking, and maybe gives us that time to have choice and space to do something different. So what's a helpful sort of metaphor or way of describing this is, if you look at the sky today is miserable and it's full of clouds. But at other times it's completely clear and it's deep blue and expansive. At other times there's dark thunderclouds and lightnings. Sky is continuously changing. The clouds are continuously changing. Sometimes there's big, fast moving clouds going across the sky. But rather than getting sort of caught up in what's the shape, what's the size, why are those clouds there? What effect are they going to, what's going to happen? What effect are they going to have? We're simply just watching those clouds. We're acknowledging and accepting their presence. We're not judging why they're there. We're not questioning why they're there. We're just accepting that they're there and we're watching them go by. So these are sort of the most important things to remember with mindfulness. It's the ABCs technically. So awareness, being with your experience, so sitting with that experience rather than automatically reacting on autopilot, and then eventually seeing things and responding more wisely. So giving you that time and that space within which you can make a conscious decision about how you react. So there's lots of mindfulness resources around. lots of apps that are very kid friendly. I've also got some listed at the end as well, but these are some techniques that you can try. And again, it's introducing and practicing these when your child is calm and is going to be receptive to it and is going to be able to take it on board. And again, some of these may not work. Some people really struggle with the body scan or the body focus. They find it really uncomfortable to be focusing on their body, and that actually causes them a lot of distress. So if it causes someone distress or it's very, very frustrating, obviously you don't need to stick with it, and you can try something different. Okay. So just in terms of time, I had added a bit on low mood and depression. So I'm going to, rather than go through that, I'm going to send you the slides, so the information is there if you need it. I just wanted to leave some time for questions if you had any. But the last thing I wanted to show you, so in terms of meltdowns, we sort of covered it with the anxiety. It's really about preempting meltdowns and trying to be proactive. So, and that's trying to understand what's going on, what's triggering those meltdowns. And that's using those ABC charts to trying to figure out what the triggers are, and then trying to avoid or mitigate them. So obviously it's not always possible to avoid every situation, but really trying to avoid them where you can, where it is possible, because meltdown behavior is something that's out of someone's control. Once they've reached that point, there's very little until they've regulated themselves again. It's very difficult, exactly like you were saying, where to implement strategies. So it's about preempting them. But these are just some de-escalation strategies that you can try in a meltdown. And really sensory, like creating positive sensory experiences can be really helpful here, and self-soothing strategies. And it might be that everyone needs just a minute to calm down by themselves. Okay, so in terms of resources, so I'm just going to spend a bit of time going through these with you. These are books all about autism in general. So if you wanted to further your understanding of how autism can present, and the ways that can impact on your child's mental health, these can be really really helpful for that. These are a lot of useful websites. So the Cognis occupational therapy website is up there. The National Autistic Society, the Sutton branch, is particularly good. So I would recommend also making contact there. Okay, so I've just seen your question. So in terms of seeing the negative, that is a thinking style that often accompanies low mood. And so what you can do to sort of help with that is there are these things called thinking traps or cognitive distortions. And so it can be helpful for you to spend a bit of time to sort of work with your son in terms of, is he falling into any of those traps? And is there maybe a different way of looking at something? And practicing that. So that can be, just thinking of an example. So if he so one of the thinking traps is catastrophizing. So expecting the worst to happen. So you can spend a bit of time, identifying, and again, I can send you some resources on that, but identifying what thinking trap he might be falling into, and then looking at the thought that he's having or the way that he's viewing a particular situation. And then helping him develop what's a different way that he can can think about that. And really what can also help as well is if you've noticed that it's having oh, sorry. So there might be a lot going on there as well. But if you notice that it's having an impact on his mood, helping him to see that, to make that link between, I had, oh, I thought I went on holiday and I thought that this was going to happen, and then asking him how he felt or feels in the moment, and then he can make that link of, oh, I thought this and I felt this way, and then maybe the next time using it, reframing it in a different way and seeing, does that have an impact on his mood? The other way that we tend to that's sort of the main way that we would tackle the negative thinking side of low mood. Thanks for sharing that, Angela. The other thing in terms of what you were saying, is it may also be that this is where it's really important to involve the child, because it may also be that he's built up this experience in his head and he thinks it's going to be absolutely amazing, and then when he does it, it maybe doesn't reach that expectation, or maybe there's elements of it that he hasn't thought about, and it's hard to know without the examples, but maybe there's sort of sensory things that are going on that are actually impacting his ability to enjoy it. And actually he was really looking forward to it and he thought he was really enjoying it. But then when he gets there, his experience doesn't match what he thought it was going to be. And that's a really hard place to be in as well, when you thought it was going to be a particular way and it's not. I'll make sure to send things on thinking traps. Yeah, so a lot of the times, especially with teenagers, being sort of taught or being shown the way by parents can often be quite uncomfortable for teenagers, and they don't want their parents to be teaching them about how to do things. But really, if it becomes second nature to you and you're modeling things for your child, that's sort of an indirect way for them to learn. And if they have used an example, that's a way that they. Yeah, again, so that's why there's so many different things. That's why it's so tricky to be supporting your children, because there's so many different things that might be going on. So it's really about trying to unpick the situations and really trying to understand what's going on for your child, which can be really difficult if they're also struggling to know themselves or know their minds. So it is definitely a learning curve and a work in progress. All right. So these are just some useful books for children. So again, if you wanted to, this is for sort of more younger children. Some of these are about positive role models that you can use to sort of introduce the concept, whether or not your child is aware of their autism diagnosis, introduce the concept of autism, and learn about different people. There's also sort of toolkits for children themselves, which are written by autistic people about the things that they struggle with and their own advice and tips for managing those. These are really useful for teenagers, particularly. Those websites down at the bottom are all about puberty and developing relationships and sexuality, and the pitfalls that might come along with that, and the difficulties that you might have with that. So again, this is just for introducing positive role models or positive experiences about autism, sort of counteract or to just introduce the idea of autism into your family. There's also the Christine McGuinness documentary, and then these are podcasts. Some of these are made by parents, some of these are made by autistic people themselves. Some of them are made by autistic parents, so there's a whole range there. So these are books specifically on emotion regulation. These are resources for anxiety. And those are resources for depression and low mood. Okay, so what I'm going to do. Oh, okay. So, does anyone have any questions? We've got 1 minute left, but I'm able to stay on for a little bit longer if anyone has any questions. What I would ask, if people don't mind,